Hi everyone, this is Mr. P here with lesson number 16 of the Black Freedom Struggle Unit. This one is going to focus on the Chicago Freedom Movement. It's called the Chicago Freedom Movement popularly, but it's really a campaign within the larger civil rights movement. And so let's get started. I'll disappear and make this full screen. So you can check out episode 8 of Eyes on the Prize for more on this campaign, and you can read about it on the Nonviolent database following this link here. So before we get into the movement or the campaign in Chicago, I want to talk about why Dr. King and Southern Christian Leadership Conference moved to the North in 1965. So they just got done Selma. The Voting Rights Act just got signed in early August of 1965, and the Watts riots break out in LA on August 11th. And Dr. King's response to the Watts riots, well, he goes there and he's kind of shouted down by a lot of young Black folks who did not see him as a legitimate leader in Los Angeles, did not perceive him as someone who had a strategy that could work for them. They were not compelled by nonviolent strategy there. And so King is taken by that, and he realizes that it doesn't matter how much they desegregate if Black folks are not going to be able to have, I think the phrase he uses with Bayard Rustin is, it doesn't matter if they can sit at the lunch counter, what if they don't have the money to buy a hamburger at the lunch counter. And so he decides to test nonviolent strategy in the North. And it's really around 1965 that he begins to focus more heavily on economic issues like housing and jobs and wages. So he decides to test nonviolent strategy in the North as a result of the Watts riots and other issues. They had realized they were kind of reaching the kind of end of a lot of the desegregation and voting rights things. They just won the Voting Rights Act, for example. A quick background on the Watts riots. Some of you might be wondering, oh, what is that? Some of you might be familiar with it. So in Los Angeles, background, Black population had increased from 75,000 to 650,000 in a matter of 25 years due to the second stage of the Great Migration. And there were really poorly resourced schools. There was little access to public transit. Police shootings had occurred over the last couple of years prior to the riots, in which 65 Black residents were killed, 27 of them in the back, 25 unarmed. And so this created an increasing amount of frustration and anger within the Black community. It was not just in Watts, but the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles. There were other similarly related riots in New York and Philadelphia and Chicago during the 1964-65 period. In Watts in particular, two brothers here have been pulled over for a traffic stop by a white police officer. One of them failed a sobriety test, and crowd formed. There was escalation of kind of argument. There was a scuffle with one of the members of the crowd and a police officer. One police officer ended up arresting a woman who was rumored to be pregnant. It turns out she wasn't. That got more people riled up. The mother of Marquette Frye, the one who ended up getting in to a scuffle by the police officer. The mother arrives and tries to pull the police officer off of him. She's arrested too. So it escalated. The police were not able to de-escalate it. They only escalated the situation. And due to the, built up anger and frustration with shootings of armed and people in the neighborhood, these types of things led to an outbreak of riots for the next 6 days. So there were a lot of people who were impacted, a lot of damage in the city. Dr. King, though, here, I think, an important quote for us to understand the riots here. And he says, "We've got to see that a riot is the language of the unheard. And what is it that America has failed to hear? It has failed to hear that the economic plight of the poor has worsened over the last few years." And I think this is crucial, right? I think Dr. King often gets misused. People say, oh, riots are bad, like, during the Ferguson riots of in 2013-14. people say, oh, this is not what Dr. King wanted. And when we actually look at what Dr. King said, he did not dismiss riots. He said, no, riots by Black folks in response to police brutality and things like that are understandable. And it's a result of that community not being heard. And so we need to remember that. So he ends up testing out nonviolent strategy in Chicago, where the conditions were really severe in terms of the housing segregation. It's important to remember that in the 1930s, the Federal Housing Administration was established during the New Deal, and the federal government insured mortgages that banks would give to people buying homes. Now, a bank would not want to give a mortgage to somebody if the mortgage wasn't insured, because that was a high risk. So what the federal government did was they did not insure mortgages given to Black people. As a result, Black people did not have access to mortgages, and this is one of the primary ways in which people build wealth. So Black folks who wanted to buy homes often had to buy homes from predatory real estate speculators on contract. These homes were then marked up 2 to 3 times. For example, white real estate speculators would intentionally try and scare white people in white neighborhoods to sell their homes and leave, saying, oh, Black people are going to start moving in, or look, this one person moved in, more are coming. You should sell your home now. And they would buy them cheaply. White people would leave the cities, move to the suburbs. This was during the suburbanization of America. And these real estate speculators would mark the housing up 2-3 times the value. A house that was worth $12,000 is now getting sold for $25,000, $30,000 to a Black family. And their payments are high. Their interest is extremely high, higher than it would be if they were able to access real mortgages from banks. But because of federal policy, they weren't able to. This is known as redlining, and it leads to these types of predatory policies like on-contract buying. This happened in Chicago, and in particular the North Lawndale neighborhood and other neighborhoods in Chicago. So the purpose of coming here was to demand the desegregation of housing and schools, to stop discrimination in home mortgages, which was leading to these on-contract buying issues, and to invest in public housing for people who couldn't afford mortgages and buying homes. The methods was to use some marches. King nailed demands to City Hall, and he ended up even moving into the slums to try and dramatize and highlight the issues. This is a picture of him fixing up his way there. So how did white folks respond? Mayor Daley ended up avoiding confrontation by quickly responding to any problems the campaign highlighted. So if the campaign dramatized or highlighted litter and the ways in which the city government did not clean up the streets of Black neighborhoods, Mayor Daley would have a trash truck out there the next morning. So he responded to all of the problems the campaign highlighted to avoid making larger structural changes like addressing the issue of public housing or segregation of housing. And when Black marchers marched in white neighborhoods, white folks would attack them with violence. This revealed the deep violence and segregation of the North. Black folks who had done campaigns in the South actually said that when they campaigned in Chicago, they were more terrified of the white mobs of the North than they were in the South, because there were so many more of them, and the racism was so intense. Chicago agrees to open housing to Blacks, but segregation largely remained. The guarantees they made were weak and not sustaining. So they did not quite meet their goals here. And it made nonviolent strategy kind of vulnerable in the North. They weren't sure if it would work in the long term like it did in the South. This one, I just wanted to highlight the march in Cicero, a white neighborhood where no Black person lived at the time, and a good number of Black folks did work there, though, for like white families. And Dr. King called off the march because the city had agreed to meet with him and to meet with leadership, but Congress of Racial Equality led it anyway, and white residents ended up attacking these marchers in Cicero. I would pause the video now and watch this video. Go to the YouTube link here and watch the video about the story of the Contract Buyers League in Chicago after the Chicago Freedom Movement on housing had mostly failed. The Contract Buyers League formed in 1968 to fight predatory real estate speculators I had talked about, using a payment strike. So they refused to pay the people they bought their homes on contract from, to try and pressure them to renegotiate for better interest rates and a fairer payment schedule. And people like Clyde Ross, who's imaged here, and women like Ethel Witherspoon and Maddie Lewis ended up successfully renegotiating and purchasing their homes. The three of them are interviewed in this video. Ultimately, I believe it was 106 people out of about 550 who were on the payment strike successfully renegotiated. So roughly 20% of the people renegotiated for a fair, for a fair payment schedule and interest rate. But many ended up, losing their homes because they couldn't afford the high interest payments and leaving North Lawndale. One of the pieces that I like about this video is that it really helps us understand the ways in which federal policy through redlining, restricting access to Black families through $2 billion of mortgages given out between 1930 and the 1960s, really ended up exacerbating the wealth gap and building what we know as the American ghetto today. And I'm using ghetto not as a derogatory thing here, but just as its historical term, which is, a neighborhood of a particular group of people restricted from being able to leave due to structural policies and in some case racism, in some case anti-Semitism, xenophobia. So this is and other classism issues. So this is something that I think is really valuable in the video to help us understand, and also to understand the strategy of a payment strike, which we haven't talked about in the civil rights movement yet. And I really appreciate how the Contract Buyers League helps us understand the way in which a payment strike can be used for folks who are facing discriminatory, predatory policies with respect to housing. So check that out, and I look forward to you joining us for our next video on the Girard College desegregation campaign in Philadelphia. All right, ciao. Take care.